Hi there, Chris here. I'm getting ready to make myself some new shirts, and I figured I would take you along in the construction process and show you how I make them. So this is the pattern I've been using for all of my shirts. It is McCall's M6932. I've made some adjustments along the way. I've made about a dozen shirts so far for myself, but I always recommend when you make your first shirt to do it out of a fabric you don't have any attachment to, maybe a cheaper fabric, just to try it out, make sure it fits right. You're good to go. You can make adjustments from there and document them on your pattern. So I have my pattern. I've got the fabric I'll be using today. You will also need some interfacing and some fasteners. I've got these bright yellow buttons. So on the flap, it shows all of the measurements you need to take to make sure that you get the right size in your pattern. The most important one really, since it's a shirt, is just your chest measure. So to take your chest measurement, you will need a cloth measuring tape. And just wrap it around yourself. You want it at the widest point of your chest. And you want to be in a relaxed position. So you don't want your arms up. Just kind of slump down a little and don't pull this tight. Right now, at a relaxed, I'm at like 50 inches, but I could easily, make it taut and be down to 46 inches, but that wouldn't make a very comfortable shirt. Since this is a casual style shirt, if you have a little bit of extra room, it's probably a good thing. So I look like I am right at like 49 and a half when relaxed. According to the pattern, that puts me literally smack dab between XL and XXL. I will go with the larger and adjust from there. When it comes to your pattern, you have a couple options. You can just cut the tissue paper on the lines. I prefer to trace it onto another paper and cut that. Then I can make adjustments, and if ever I gain weight, lose weight, I can always go back to the original and start from scratch. So I will be using just some brown craft paper. You could also use cheap wrapping paper from the dollar store is really good. Anything really that's just nice and wide on a roll. And then I have some carbon transfer paper and a pattern tracer. This is just a wheel with little spikes that will make little dots as I trace it along. Now I've already made this pattern several times, so I already have paper copies. So I'll just trace one of the pieces to demonstrate how that's done. Now, if you're using a different pattern, I definitely recommend going through the instructions or reading it all the way through just so you understand how the shirt will be assembled. Even if you are using the same pattern, I still recommend reading through. It's got some really good information. So I will be tracing out the front because I want to show you some of the modifications I have made. So here's a good shot of all of the pieces. This is the front piece right here. Now this piece is self-facing, meaning that you would fold this piece over and that's the facing of your shirt. I prefer my facing to be a separate piece. For me, it helps me line up the pattern better. It also, depending on the fabric, is just a better use of the fabric. So this is the piece right here. You can see there's the neckline. This is the facing piece right here. There is a mark that is the center front and the fold line. What I will need to do is mark the fold line and then add 5/8 of an inch on this side. And then when tracing the facing, adding 5/8 of an inch on the other side for that seam allowance. After making several of these shirts, I also adjusted the facing that it's not quite so wide. I have it down to about 2 inches and I sew an extra line to keep it tacked down. As you make more garments, you'll learn your patterns and then you'll know where to make adjustments to best fit your body and your style. So I will get this positioned so that the entire pattern piece is on the paper. If your paper is curling, some pattern weights are your best friend. I made my own pattern weights out of some washers that I doubled up and wrapped in yarn. If you want to see how to make those, just let me know and I'll make a video. And now we start tracing our pattern. So I'll take my carbon paper, slide it between the tissue and my craft paper. I'll put a weight on the pattern also so it doesn't shift on me. And then you'll need to find which line your size is. So this has a solid line, a large dash line, and a smaller dash line. I am the one right smack dab in the middle. And then just take your tracing wheel and trace right over that line. As you're tracing, you will notice some different markings. Right here, there's a large circle with the sizes next to it. This one is mine. I'll usually just mark that within a couple lines straight through it, so I have the center. There's also these notches. You'll want to make sure to mark those. It's just a little V. And right here we have some square boxes. Also make sure you mark the one next to your size. But you're going to want to transfer all of those to your new pattern piece. When you're done with the area, you can shift around the carbon paper and move to the next spot. And here you can see my little dotted lines that I just traced. So then I would cut this with scissors and I would have my new pattern piece. I've already done that for my entire shirt, so that is what I'll be using for the rest of the video. Again, this is an optional step. You are more than welcome to simply cut the tissue paper directly on the line that you need, if that is what you want to do. I've got all of my pattern pieces. All right, so real quickly, I will just go over which pattern pieces are needed for this shirt. So you have your front piece, which I just showed you how to trace. In my case, I will need to cut out 2 front, a left and a right, as well as 2 facing pieces, since I did separate that. Then there is the pocket piece. There is a back panel, as well as 2 yokes, an inner and an outer. There are 2 collar pieces, an upper and a lower. Then I will be doing the short sleeve version of the shirt. There is in this pattern options for long sleeves, which also includes a cuff. There's also a sleeveless version, so you would have this facing right here to bind off your sleeve hole. And then this piece is cut strictly out of interfacing, and it is to interface the facing of the front. And that's really important to give stability for your buttons and your buttonholes. So the next step is to lay these all out and start cutting the fabric. Most patterns will include a layout diagram of the best way to lay out your pattern pieces and cut your fabric. It is important to note if you have a print that you are planning on matching, which I do on my shirts, it may require a little extra fabric from what the pattern has told you to purchase. In my case, I'm doing view B with 45-inch fabric. This tells me I need 2 7/8. I prefer to just get 3 yards of fabric. That way I have a little more wiggle room to match up my prints. Some patterns will give you measurements for both with and without nap. If you have a print that you're lining up, go with the with nap measurements. So here is shirt B. This is telling me how to lay it out. I tend to not go with these. I am using quilting cotton, which is really more like 42 inches. So it doesn't always lay out properly, but this is a good place to start. If you've never sewn a garment, refer to this to give you an idea of how to lay it out. But I'll show you my method. There are a few ways to cut your fabric. You can always pin your pattern and then cut it with scissors, or you can do what I'm going to do and use pattern weights and a rotary cutter to cut my pieces. It's just a little faster for me. You will want to pre-wash and press your fabric. Mine's been folded up for a little bit, so there's some creases, but nothing to worry about. And I prefer to cut my front panels first. I figure they're front and center. That's the first thing people are going to see. So those are the ones that I want to make sure are right on point. If you want to make sure that your pattern is all perfectly lined up, I do have another video on my channel of just matching the pattern, so I will link that in the comments below. So basically just get this where you want it to be. Start placing some pattern weights. Then you can take your rotary cutter and just cut around. After matching up my pattern, I like to use the first piece I cut as my pattern piece to cut the second. So as long as they are right sides together, you'll have both a left and a right front piece. I like my pockets on the front left panel, which is this one. Next, I'm going to match up the pocket. So the pocket placement are some of those markings that you would have transferred over. It is these 2 dots right here. So what I do is line this up, fold back so both of those dots are right there. And then I'll use a disappearing pen. This pen disappears with heat. and mark those two lines. You can take a ruler and draw a line between them just to make it a little bit more visible. And for the full details on matching up the pattern for the pocket as well as the front button line, go check out that video I have linked down below. There's our pocket. Now I'll cut out the rest of the main body pieces, and I'll be back when it's time to cut out the interfaced pieces. Now it's time to cut the interfaced pieces. My preferred method when having to cut out both the fabric and interfacing in the same shape is to fuse the interfacing to the fabric and then cut it all out together. So to do that, I will take my interfacing and cut 2 of the facing and 1 of the collar. Very rough cut. I want some extra interfacing on all sides. And now I'll take these and go fuse it onto the leftover fabric. All right, the interfacing is fused on. So now I can cut out my pattern pieces. I've got all my pieces cut out and they've been marked and interfaced where required. So I have my 2 front pieces, a left and a right, along with the pocket. Got my back, both yokes, both collars, one of which is interfaced, left and right front facing, both of which are interfaced, and my 2 sleeves. On to the next step. Next step is to prepare our pocket. I like to start by marking the fold along the top, which is on the pattern piece. I'll actually mark it on the back side of the fabric because we need to fold this right sides together and then press that. And now we fold the raw edge up about 1/4 of an inch. Then I like to mark 5/8 of an inch from the edge. That is where my sewing line will be. And then just sew these 2 lines right there. All right, and now we just take these corners. I like to clip them just to reduce a little bulk. And then we're going to turn them right side out and use a chopstick or a corner turner. Get some nice crisp corners. And then press that. The rest of these raw edges need to be turned under 5/8 of an inch. So I'll mark that with my disappearing pen. And then start to fold those over. Now before we pin this to our shirt, we need to just do our quick hem stitch right along that edge. And you'll want to make sure you just catch this little fold while you're stitching. Now that the pocket's hemmed, we can pin it to the front. This is my front left panel with my markings for pocket placement. I prefer to line up based on the pattern versus the actual markings. Sometimes it's off just a little, but it does not matter once that line goes away. Now take it back to the machine and sew this down. And there we have a perfectly placed pocket. I like to start here, sew up, go over about 2 stitches, sew around, come back to the top, sew over 2 stitches, and come down to the hem line. I just find that makes it more secure at the top. And now we can erase our placement line. Just like that. My next step, which will not be in the instructions, is to attach the facing pieces, since I detached them in the pattern tracing process. I'll just reattach them now. So that one goes there. And just attach them with a 5/8 inch seam all the way down. And now I will press these seams open. So now I need to do an understitch, which is about a 1/16 of an inch away from this seam on the facing side, just to keep that in place. I also need to serge this edge because it will stay raw within the garment and I don't want it fraying over time. So there you can see I have the edge all serged, which will just keep it from fraying. This piece eventually will be tucked under. That will remain exposed, so you don't want it to be just a plain raw edge. And now we'll prepare the back. So we have our back piece, and then we'll need the yoke that is going to face out. The pattern does call for you to make some markings, but I have found a cheat to not have to do that. So we will start with our yoke face up, and we need to mark the center. I just fold it in half and put a pin right in the center. I will also put a pin 3/4 of an inch on either side of center. Now on the backing piece, we also need to mark center. I still have it folded in half from when I cut it, so I will just add that pin. I'll unfold this and lay those edges together. And we will go ahead and pin them together in the center. Now you'll see that the back piece is slightly longer than the yoke. That's going to give us the extra fabric for the pleat in the center of the back. So what I'll do is I start from the edge, lining up the fabrics and pinning. And then when we get to this 3/4 inch mark, I'll go ahead and move the pin so it's going through both layers of fabric. You'll take that excess and fold it over, just like that. Pin this down. There you can see the different layers, and that makes the pleat. So this side is all pinned together, and I repeat it on the other side. And now we're ready to sew. Just sew along at 5/8 of an inch. Now that that's sewn, we need to press the seam up towards the yoke. Now we're going to take the back and attach the front pieces at the shoulders. The shoulder there, and you'll match up your little notches. If you want, you can pin to keep everything in order. And now you're going to take the second yoke piece. These right here, though they're short, are also shoulder seams. So with right sides together, just pin those towards the inside of the yoke so that the neck is continuous. So what you'll end up with is kind of a big continuous loop for the neck. Now we'll go and sew all 4 of these seams. And now we're going to press all of those seams towards the yoke pieces. For the seams where the facing meets the yoke, you'll want to press the rest of this seam at 5/8 of an inch. Just press it under. So that's all pressed, and basically it is one big loop. We're going to set this aside and make our collar. So we have our 2 collar pieces. One has interfacing, one does not. The one with interfacing will be the top collar. But for now, we're going to put these right sides together, and we're going to sew along the 2 short ends, and then this end here. It's the end that's slightly shorter. The flared end is what gets sewn into the shirt. Before I sew this, I am going to remark because I'll be pressing this. These marks are going to disappear. This is on the wrong side of the fabric, so I'll just use a pencil. It won't show. To redo some of those markings, these will be important when we go to pin it to the shirt. And I'll do it on both sides. Triangles and the little dots are the important ones. So I'll just go sew this. Before we turn this right side out, we need to grade the corners, which is just clipping so that you're close to the seam, but don't cut through your stitches, but maybe like 1/8 of an inch away. This is just going to reduce a lot of bulk in the corner. Now we will turn it right side out. Poke out those corners gently. Or the best way I have found to press is to start by pressing this seam open, and then just getting up into the corner, pressing it open. And then with the non-interfaced side on the top, you can fold it just along that seam, and you want to be able to barely see that seam on this side so that on the top side it's invisible. And then just press everything down. It's all pressed, so I'll take it back to the machine and do a top stitch around the seams that you already sewed. Now that we've got our collar sewn and pressed and top stitched, it's time to pin it into the shirt. This is where those triangle markings are going to come in very handy. You can see them there, and then also on the yoke. There's one there and one there. So that's all of those will line up when you pin them together. I like to start from the center and work my way out. So I'll fold the collar in half, put a pin in there, and then fold each of these in half, just matching up the shoulder seams, popping in a pin. Now I'm ready to start adding my collar. As I mentioned, the side with the interfacing is the top collar. So I'm going to start with that facing up. And then this is the back of the shirt, also facing up. Align those center marks. And then bring in the inside yoke, also lining up those center marks. Get them all aligned and then pin. You can take all the pins out and then just put one back going through all of the. Next, I'll find those triangle markings and get them all lined up and pop a pin in there. Do that for both sides. Now here you're working with some curves, and curves can be a little tricky because the neck you can see is curved like this. then the collar itself is straight, if not curved in the opposite direction. So you're going to want to use a lot of pins. Usually I will pin about every inch or so. So just make sure all of your edges are lined up. Put in a pin. So go about an inch, put in a pin, make sure all of your layers are lined up. Put in another pin. This is really going to help you out when you get back to the sewing machine. And I'll just continue my way out to the edge, and then whatever amount I have left between the fold and the edge of the collar, I will make sure I have the same distance on the other side. It's usually about 3/4 of an inch to an inch for my shirts. There is a marking on the pattern. It's a small circle, but I ironed it away and forgot to remark it. All right, so I've made it to the end of the collar, and I will just measure to that fold. We're right at 3/4 of an inch. So to remember that, I will go ahead and mark the other side at 3/4 of an inch, and then just continue pinning the other side. All right, lots of pins all the way down. And now we're just going to sew our 5/8 inch seam all the way down. And that will attach the collar. Got the collar all sewn in. I did go back just to make sure I didn't have any folds or tucks in my seam. So now before we turn this right side out, we need to make some clips. Because this is a curve, there's not a lot of give, which will be important when we go to do our top stitching. So I do like to clip the corners just to reduce bulk, and then just make a little notch every 2 inches or so, just to relieve some of that strain. Make sure you don't clip your seams though. Right, now we'll turn it right side out and push out the corners. We now have a collar. Next, we need to attach down the inside yoke. So first I need to press under the bottom 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to mark it real quick just to help myself. All right, working from the inside of the shirt, we're going to smooth this down and pin it in place. I like to start from the center and work my way out. And we're going to pin along this bottom as well as the 2 shoulder seams so that we can top stitch to get everything secured. We're ready to take this to the machine. I prefer to do my top stitching from the right side. So as I'm sewing along, I'll just pull the pins out. The next step I'm going to do is serge up the side seams and the armhole seams. So I will just, with my serger, start at the bottom, go up, go around the inside of the armhole, and then down the other side, and then repeat on the other side. While I am at the serger, I'm also going to serge from this divot right here, up and around on both of the sleeves. This seam is going to remain exposed inside the garment, so again, we don't want it to fray, so I'll do that serge. Next step is to sew up the 2 side seams. Very simple. And then once those are sewn, I'll go back to the serger and serge all along the bottom edge so that I can hem the shirt. If you don't want to serge the bottom edge, you can just do a double fold hem. So you would fold it in once and fold it again. I like to just do a serge, fold it once, and hem it. When sewing around the collar, you'll want to make sure that you don't have any bubbles or tucks or pleats. Pull it taut as you are sewing to make sure you don't have any wrinkles or bumps. Now that the body is assembled, we can move on to the sleeves. So first we need to press the hem for both of the sleeves. For my pattern, I need to first press up 1¼ inches. So I'm going to mark that. It just helps me have a consistent line. It may look like it, but this is not a perfectly flat edge. There is a very slight curve to it. So just move your ruler along, continue to mark at 1¼ inch. There's the first sleeve. Now we'll do the second sleeve. All right, there's the first one. And the second one. And now we're going to mark again, but this time from the fold, we're going to mark how much this needs to turn under. I like to mark from the fold versus the raw edge. I just find it gets a more consistent hem when I'm done. So I mark 7/8 of an inch from the fold. I'll do that on both sleeves. And now we're going to press on that line, folding the raw edge under. And now we'll head on over to the sewing machine to sew up the side and then hem the bottom. We'll start with right sides together. We need to unfold the hem we just pressed. Get everything lined up, and we'll sew 5/8 of an inch. Once you hit this first crease, you'll pivot and sew the other way. So once you have your needle in that crease, you can lift your presser foot and sew the other angle. I find it helpful to snip this right here, almost to the stitching, and then also to cut off this point. And now we can finger press this seam open, as well as right here, and fold it back to where we pressed it. For the most part, the sleeve lays pretty flat, so I don't pin except for right here. I will pin this to keep everything in place while I'm sewing. I will pin on both sides of the seam, just to be safe. I don't have a free arm on my machine, so I just sew it like this. And I will be sewing at 3/4 of an inch. Because we pressed under 7/8 of an inch, that will leave That will put my stitching about 1/8 of an inch from that fold. I like to start at the seam. This will be in the armpit, so if it's not the prettiest, no one will see it. First sleeve is ready. Now let's do the other one. And now we need to attach our sleeves. So on your pattern, there will be 2 notches, and that indicates the back of the sleeve, a single notch on the front of the sleeves. When I serge the edges, I tend to lose those notches. So another way to tell is if you fold it from the seam, keeping the cuff straight, the back side will have a little bit more fabric than the front side. And that's just to allow movement. So this goes on this side, and this goes on this side. There are some little dots that you would have transferred over from your pattern, and that's going to help us get these set in place. So we'll start with this sleeve. It's easiest if your shirt body is inside out. I prefer to start by putting a pin in the armpit, matching up the 2 seams. And I'll fold them open just to reduce some bulk. And then pinning the top of the sleeve, which will have a large dot. So those 2 dots are right there. Just line them up. And then make sure that the edges are even. Pop in a pin. And then to either side of that large dot, there is a smaller dot. Right there. And right there. Line those up. Again, make sure that the edges of the fabric are in line, and then pin it. So the dot's there and there. Line up the edges. Now on sleeves, you're going to want to use quite a few pins. As you can see, there seems to be extra fabric here, but as you sew it and tug it and turn it, it is going to even out. But the easiest thing to do is just split the difference about halfway, pin that down, and you'll just be easing the fabric into place. Sometimes you will have to pull on the backside a little bit to get it to sew down flat because you don't want any folds or ripples in your sleeve. You'll end up with a little ruffle, which probably is not the ideal. You are working with a little bit of bias, so there is some wiggle room. And remember, you are sewing 5/8 of an inch in, so at that point, the fabric does meet up better than it does at the edge. As you get closer to the armpit, it is a little easier to fit everything in just because there's bias on both sides of fabric. If you find that you still have too much fullness in the top, I would unpin, keep the center pin, but unpin the other 2 and try to ease some of that in around the rest of the armhole. Some fabrics play better than others. Another tip, if you still have a lot of fullness, is to put the side with the fullness down on your sewing machine so that the feed dogs can help ease that in. But I'll just check along where the pins are. I still have a little bit there. But not necessarily at the edge of the fabric, but 5/8 of an inch in where your seam is going to be. If you give it a gentle tug, will it lay flat? Right here I still have too much. So I will work that a little out. See right there. Now I will have it perfect. That looks good. That one's got a little extra. So I'll just take the 1 pin out. It's easiest to do it with the pins than it is to have to rip out a full seam. Oops. Didn't mean to do that, but anyway, to rip out a full seam and re-sew it. So use lots of pins, get it right where you want it, and then we'll take it to the machine. As you're sewing, use your finger to feel the next couple inches where you'll be sewing. You'll usually be able to feel if there's any bumps or folds so that you can correct them before you sew them into place. If you like, you can top stitch your sleeves. Typically the seam would be pressed towards the body and top stitched about 1/4 of an inch. I personally don't do that on my shirts. I just let the seams lie where they lie. All right, now we do that with the other sleeve. Now that the sleeves are attached, we can move on to the buttonholes. I prefer to have the left side overlapping the right side, so I will put the buttonholes on the left, and the buttons will attach on the right. The pattern does come with a buttonhole guide that you can cut out or trace. I just took the measurements so I can mark directly onto the garment. So I will do that now. My buttons go in 5/8 of an inch from the edge. I start the top button at 3 inches. So I'll mark the center line as well as the cross. So that's where the center of the button will fall. And then the rest are 4 1/4 inches apart. Again, I'll mark the center. And then the cross for the center of the button. And I have a total of 6 buttons on the front of the shirt. Back to the sewing machine. Since I sew on a vintage machine, I don't have any kind of automatic button holder. So I do have this attachment that replaces the foot on my machine, and it's already set for the size of buttons that I'm using, and this will automatically sew my buttonhole. So let me get that attached. So basically I'll just take the marks that I just made, center them in this opening, and it will do the rest. The buttonholes are all sewn, and now we need to open them up. To do this, you can use your regular seam ripper as long as the blade in there is nice and sharp. You can also use just a plain craft knife. I will be using this scalpel style seam ripper because it's the sharpest blade I have, which will give you the best results. So if you're new to buttonholes, you can save yourself by inserting a pin at the top and bottom of the buttonholes, and that will prevent you from accidentally slicing too far. So just take that, then your nice sharp blade, and very carefully cut right in the middle of all of your stitching. Now you have a buttonhole. All right, all of the buttonholes have been cut open, so now it's time to do the buttons. You can make the same measurements on the other side to add your buttons, or you can just lay this down, line it up, and mark straight through the buttonholes. If you have a print you're lining up, check out my other video. Adding the buttons is the last step to make sure that you have a perfectly matched pattern. So I will be using these bright yellow buttons. I need 6 of them. And you'll want to use thread that matches your buttons, not that matches your shirt. I like to double up my thread when I thread my needle. So I'll thread through 2 threads. And you don't want to cut it too long because it will get tangled. But this way I'm sewing with 4 threads. Just saves a little time sewing the buttons on. Make sure they're nice and secure. What I do is I'll go down at a diagonal because these are 4-hole buttons. We'll be making an X to attach them. And then leave yourself like a 2 or 3 inch tail. Don't knot it and don't pull it all the way through. All right, we've got our first stitch, and then come up through one of the holes that does not have thread in it yet. And then go down the diagonal to that. Come up in one of the first set. So now there's 2 stitches in that set. Come up in the second set, and instead of going all the way through the fabric here, if you push the fabric aside and go through the hole of the button only, you can then take your threads and tie them off. I like to tie them 3 times, just to make sure they're nice and secure. And then you need to make a shank on this button that will allow this bulk of fabric to fit under the button easily. So to do that, just take your thread, and if you loop it over on itself, just like that, place it under the button and pull it tight. And do that 3 times. So if you have your thread straight, just twist your hand, pinch it. So the needle, the thread on the needle should be underneath this loop. There we go. And then to end it off, I will take my needle, pass it through just under the top fabric, out to the edge. So you can't see the needle on the top, you can't see the needle on the bottom, it just comes out the edge, and then snip it. And then snip this thread as well. There we go. First button's attached. Now I'll do the other 5. Okay, the buttons are all attached, so now I'll take it over to the iron to erase all of my markings, and then I'm done. And there you have it. Oh, wait. That's better. A few final tips. Be sure to give yourself time, especially with your first shirt. Typically, these shirts take me anywhere from like 3.5 to 4 hours to make. This shirt, with filming, took me probably close to 10. If you don't have a serger, that's fine. You can zigzag over the edge of the raw fabric, or you can hem it. You just want some way to finish off that edge so that as you wash your shirt over time, it doesn't fray and your shirt will last you longer. And then lastly, just have fun. Have fun with your fabrics, with the pattern placement. You can have different fabrics throughout your shirt. You can replace the fabric for the yoke, for the collar. I have several shirts that the yoke and collar are different fabrics because I just didn't have enough of the main body of fabric. And then be sure to wear your shirt and let everyone know that you made it. Thanks for watching.